What a headshot! What a head!
How's it guys, this is Dayvy, FPL, and welcome back to the Fantasy Premier League video here on my channel. Now in this video, I'll be going over the top 5 overpriced midfielders. So continuation of this overpriced series, this is going to be the third installment, and the third position, it's all about the big position of the midfielders. So this Premier League season and this FPL season, the midfielder options, there's so many of them, they're so well priced. So are there any options that we actually considered overpriced and might avoid? And these players might be in your drafts, might not be, they might actually cook up a conversation of should they be in your teams. So not all of these options are actually bad. That's going to be the big disclaimer that I've mentioned throughout every video I've done on the overpriced options. Just because a midfielder is in this video doesn't mean they're a bad FPL asset. They might have been injured last season, they might have had kind of a rotation pairing, or they might have been a little bit off form. We're discussing all three factors in this video. Now tomorrow will be the last video, the goalkeeper segment, and then next week we'll be going over the best options and deciding which midfielders and which positions to actually pick. So make sure your notifications are turned on if you do enjoy this video, as more is going to come. With that being said, sit back, relax, and let's get into this video. Now quickly, a little bit of an introduction into how I actually created this video, just to give you guys some context of the solution to the problem. The player data I used was the points of last season and the prices of this season, as that's what FPL actually used to create the prices. So using the past points to hopefully predict the future points, which isn't always the best scenario. Then next up, not every midfielder was covered in this video, it was only the players that scored more than 60 points, so our filter was 60 points plus. This is kind of a number I arrived at. I wanted to go over options that will feature most games, and that's why they got 30 games and 2 points. Other than that though, if they got 1 or 2 attacking returns, they probably would have more than 60 points, so even players that joined in January should still be featured. Then lastly, how to determine if they were over or underpriced was a regression line. I plotted an averaging line of all the options that have more than 60 points, and if they're above or below that line, they were over or underpriced. Now I went through that quite quickly, so if you guys have any questions about the methodology, comment down below on my Discord server where I'm slightly more active. But let's go on to the actual plot and see which midfielders are considered overpriced this Premier League season. On screen right now, you guys are going to see all these options are actually overpriced. Now I've only covered the options that are below the regression line, and your eyes are probably drawn to the top right, so yes, Mo Salah this season is considered overpriced. Now his distance from the regression line is pretty small, but just remember this probably favors those cheaper positions that generally have better value. If you were to bring in Mo Salah like an Erling Haaland, you'll probably captain him once in a while, so therefore you can almost double his points. If you double his points, his value looks a lot better, as he therefore will be above the regression line. But Salah, De Bruyne and Heung-min Son are kind of the big three options that are considered overpriced, but as you guys know, Kevin De Bruyne injured last season, Heung-min Son had a very off season, and Mo Salah, Liverpool didn't have their best. So all three of these assets I think are great FPL options on their day. Heung-min Son could be severely underpriced come the end of the season, but right now, based on last season's points, just a reminder that he had an absolute stinker. So what I want to do now is to give you more of a kind of readable data. I want to take these three options out, so Mo Salah, Kevin De Bruyne and Heung-min Son, as mentioned, all kind of might be anomalies, could be great FPL assets at the end of this season, but right now, I just need a little bit of caution. The only exception there is probably Mo Salah if you guys want to captain him, probably looking at Game Week 2, so if you guys are going to captain the Egyptian, just ignore this graph. So taking those three options away, this kind of makes the data a little bit easier to read. Now there are a bunch of kind of 5.0s and 5.5s, but not many of us are looking at this kind of price point. So let's focus on the right hand side. So only 8.0 midfielder at the current moment that is considered to be overpriced is going to be Diogo Jota, and he's actually been reclassified. The reason I'm saying that is that if he did play most games, he'll get a clean sheet kind of point for Liverpool, and therefore his kind of points metric would be slightly higher. An extra point per goal would have also taken him up, so just keep that in mind. But let's kind of use Jota, and if you guys look slightly lower to the left, you also have Luis Diaz here from Liverpool. These two options I want to talk about because if you're going to be going for Liverpool attacker, they're quite attractive. Now I mentioned this yesterday in the kind of forwards video, Darwin Núñez and also Gakpo, we don't exactly know what the Liverpool lineup's going to be, and I expect this to continue throughout the opening games. I think that Klopp will probably rotate his front three quite heavily. Remember, Mo Salah on the right wing is the most nailed, and that's why he's quite expensive. But Jota, Diaz, they can start at centre forward, they can start at left wing, and maybe throughout preseason we'll get more of an indication who Klopp is favouring. But at the current moment, I'd probably avoid these assets. We have more kind of options that are better value and are more nailed. But continuing into the 7.5 kind of metric, we've got James Maddison here, a player that I think had a relatively kind of bad season last season. In a new club, for Spurs, he could actually be quite good. But for me at the current moment, if you want to take a punt at a 7.5 bracket, potentially look at him, but I probably prefer Foden. Talking about kind of Man City assets, let's go over Mahrez and Grealish. Mahrez is going to probably leave the club at the current moment, so just ignore him, let's focus on Grealish. Now in terms of Grealish, actually had a pretty strong season last season, played actually quite a few minutes for Pep. He really liked him at that left wing slot, but unfortunately his games don't really return the most FPL points. So if you guys do want to go for an option that plays the majority of games, maybe Grealish is the one to go for, but I would probably avoid, as unfortunately it doesn't always result in FPL points. Then we have Kai Havertz, had a bad season at Chelsea but has moved to Arsenal, should probably play in that lineup, we just don't know where. Could play at striker, could play as a kind of 10. The preseason under Arteta will give us more insight. Then moving on to that 7.0 bracket, a lot of options here, Sterling, Kulusevski especially. We have Mason Mount and Antonio, would probably avoid them, but Kulusevski and Sterling are quite enticing options. Sterling could make a joke of his price tag this season. If you guys have played FPL for a while, you'll know that Sterling has had massive FPL seasons, but unfortunately last season wasn't too great. But I think the same could be said about any Chelsea attacker. Last season was simply an anomaly, and under Pochettino I expect him to have quite good returns. Kulusevski as well, if you guys want to go for a cheap option to Harry Kane or Heung-min Son, but I'm not too bullish on that kind of Spurs frontline. Then going below that price bracket, as I've mentioned, not too many options are actually looking at this price bracket. Most managers are going kind of 7.5 upwards, but you guys can pause the screen right now if you want a deeper dive. But now let's go on to the top 5 overpriced options, and as mentioned in this series, I've changed this up. In the underpriced options, it's a very kind of easy metric to measure. It's the distance from the regression line to the player, but that's the positive outlook. The negative outlook is slightly more tough. So for example, I could have taken any kind of 4.5, 5.0 midfielder that probably played the minimum of points, 60 points, and they'd probably be the most overpriced options. But that's what I want to go over. I want to go over useful insights. So I decided to go over 5 options that I think might be overpriced, but could actually turn out to be underpriced. So for example, the first option, Raheem Sterling, he's on this list as an overpriced option, but he is 7.0 million only. Now Chelsea had a bad season last season, Sterling included, but if they do pick up the pace, could make an absolute mockery of that price point. I mentioned this in the previous talking point, has had great FPL seasons, so I expect Raheem to actually have a pretty decent one at that cheaper price point. So let's see where we stand at the end of the season, but my expectation is that he's a great option to look at, especially when Chelsea have great fixtures. The next up, another option that had a pretty bad season, it's Heung-min Son. Yes, he is slightly more expensive than these other options, but if he does bang, you guys know that Son needs a great FPL asset. Now let's see how Spurs can line up in preseason, but I expect him to play as a second striker, so almost out of position. So fingers crossed, because I do really like Son, hopefully he has a great season and becomes an FPL asset. Then we have Mason Mount at his cheaper price point, 7.0, but I probably would avoid. New team, new system, where's he going to adapt? It's a wait and see for me. Now I've seen some people look at Mason Mount as an option or an alternative for Bruno Fernandes or Rashford, but I'd probably delay that and just pay the more expensive price tag. Now Mount could be a great asset at the end of the day, but I probably prefer Bruno or Rashford. Then we have Jack Grealish, an option that I mentioned in terms of those kind of Man City attackers. I probably would take a punt elsewhere. If you're going to be going for a Man City attacker, unfortunately he doesn't always result in FPL points. Now he might be more nailed than a Foden or maybe an Alvarez, but I personally prefer the punt on those two. Now the last option, Diego Jota, I've seen a couple of drafts include him. I think they're quite excited about his reclassification as a midfielder, but as mentioned with these Liverpool assets, quite hard to predict he's going to start. If Jota does start though, I would heavily look at him. He's a great FPL asset, usually scores when he plays, and his points per 90 minutes is pretty strong. But for the time being, until we've seen some preseason, I probably wouldn't go for many Liverpool attackers besides Salah. Let me know if you guys agree with me. In the comments down below, you can roast me or agree with me. Are there any other options that you guys are potentially avoiding that are considered overpriced? Always love to see you guys' insights and thoughts. Drop them in the comments down below on my Discord server, link in the description. Now the last talking point I want to go over is going to be the points per 90 minutes. And I'll be going over this in more depth next week when we actually decide who's the best midfielders to go for, considering all the factors. Now you guys will see that there's a couple of options here that were considered overpriced. A De Bruyne, Salah on the top right hand side, even a Jota has a very good points per 90 minutes. Now these players, obviously if you guys can afford to take a punt on them, want to take a risk, they could be great FPL assets. It's all about taking that risk. This more relates to kind of a Jota and those cheaper price points because of Salah and De Bruyne, you pay the more expensive price tag, so they should give you more FPL points. But for example, just take a look at a Jota there at just below the 6.5 mark. We have a Luis Diaz at just above the 5.5 mark. These Liverpool assets when they play get you FPL points, but are they actually going to start? So just keep that in mind. Also with Jack Grealish, when you do compare Grealish to maybe a De Bruyne or Foden, even a Mahrez, you can see that his points per 90 minutes is slightly lower, and that's why I prefer these other assets. Obviously Mahrez might be leaving the club, so that might make Jack Grealish a better option, but I generally think his role should stay the same. You can see at the bottom side, Maddison, Sterling showing that a bad FPL season, as well as Heung-min Son. But just wanted to give you guys a taste of this kind of stat just to show you that you shouldn't always look at the kind of prices. There could be more of a story behind the scenes. But we'll be talking about this next week when we do go over the best midfielders, so make sure those notifications are turned on. But this is basically going to wrap up the video guys. Hope you did enjoy it. Please don't forget to like if you did and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. See you guys tomorrow for the most overpriced goalkeepers. Looking forward to it. But I'll be signing off. This has been Dayvy FPL and I'm out. Cheers, bye.